I really think the military option would be, of all of the range of options that are being discussed, obviously the most extreme, and I think would jeopardize the strategic gains that the administration has made within NATO and for priorities related to our relations with Europe as well.
So the White House this evening has made another statement on Greenland, stating that acquiring the country is a national security priority, and that using the military is always an option at the Commander-in-Chief's disposal. The US Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, said no one would stand in the way of America if they took control of the country. He was speaking to CNN earlier.
The real question is, by what right does Denmark assert control over Greenland? What is the basis of their territorial claim? What is their basis of having Greenland as a colony of Denmark? The United States is the power of NATO. For the United States to secure the Arctic region, to protect and defend NATO and NATO interests, obviously Greenland should be part of the United States. And so that's a conversation that we're going to have. There's no need to even think or talk about this in the context that you're asking of a military operation. Nobody's going to fight the United States militarily over the future of Greenland.
Well, earlier on the programme, I got reaction to this from Lord Darragh, former British ambassador to the US, a former national security advisor.
What I make of it is it's absolutely unprecedented and extraordinary stuff. All this stuff from Stephen Miller about, what right does Denmark have to Greenland is just deflecting and trying to change the subject, because there's no question about Danish sovereignty over Greenland, although Greenland may have long-term aspirations to some form of independence. But it's still very difficult for someone with a background of 40-odd years in diplomacy to imagine how we're in a state where one NATO country, effectively the leader of NATO, is effectively threatening military action against another NATO country, against an ally, over its wish to basically grab a piece of that country's territory.
Well, it all comes just hours after Britain and France committed to deploying troops to Ukraine in the event of a peace deal with Russia. They've signed a declaration of intent after a meeting in Paris of 35 countries in the so-called Coalition of the Willing. Crucially, the US will agree to support the force if it's attacked, according to a draft statement. Sir Keir Starmer set out the plan for military hubs across Ukraine.
It paves the way for the legal framework under which British, French and partner forces could operate on Ukrainian soil, securing Ukraine's skies and seas and regenerating Ukraine's armed forces for the future. We discussed these issues in detail today, and so I can say that following a ceasefire, the UK and France will establish military hubs across Ukraine and build protected facilities for weapons and military equipment to support Ukraine's defensive needs.
Well, the US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff said President Trump stands strongly behind the security arrangements.
We think we're largely finished with security protocols, which are important so that the people of Ukraine know that when this ends, it ends forever. But we also think, critically, that we are very, very close to finishing up as robust a prosperity agreement as any country has ever seen coming out of conflicts like this. It will aspirationally mean large possibilities for the Ukrainian people.
Well, I'm joined now by Katherine Thompson, who's a senior fellow at Cato for Defence and Foreign Policy and a former senior official at the Pentagon during the Trump administration. Good evening to you, Katherine.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Good to have you with us. First of all, this latest statement, President Trump and his team discussing a range of methods for acquiring Greenland, saying that this is a national security priority and military force would always be an option. I mean, what do you make of this?
I really think, at least on the military, the administration's been clear since day one that the Arctic and certainly this, discussion of Greenland has been top of mind since day one. I think Caroline Leavitt's statement was perhaps a bit more couched than Stephen Miller's in terms of saying that, the military option is an option at the president's disposal, but, certainly non-committal that was like where the conversation is driving. And I believe before we hopped on, I was seeing reports from Politico and Reuters that there may have been some clarity that that has been gotten from the administration in terms of the actual focus of the conversation right now is less about a military option and more focused on purchasing Denmark or establishing some sort of compact of free association type agreement. And I really think the military option would be, of all of the range of options that are being discussed, obviously the most extreme, and I think would jeopardize the strategic gains that, the administration has made within NATO and for priorities related to our relations with Europe as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing in the Times reporting that the options include the US buying Greenland from Denmark, forming a compact of free association with the territory. But that military option is there. I mean, Greenland is part of Denmark. It's part of the Kingdom of Denmark, which is a NATO ally.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And I think this is where, the administration would be butting up if they really did go for such an extreme option, which I think is unlikely. I think they would be butting up against the strategic gains we've had within the NATO alliance. I mean, the rhetoric at the beginning of the administration was, NATO allies committing to 5%. And Europeans taking a more primary responsibility role when it comes to conventional defense, primarily so that NATO would be stronger at the end of the day and at the end of those discussions. And I think those are strategic gains that have, largely been made, certainly since the 5% commitment. And then what we're seeing in terms of actual defense spending from some of the major European powers. And so I think, this sort of military option and the inflammatory rhetoric, I think is rightly to be read as something that is not should not be strategically palatable to the administration, because I think it would set back those gains.
Yeah, I mean, we've already had a warning from the Danish leader that if the United States, which is seen very much as the leader of NATO, were to attack a fellow NATO country, I mean, that would be the end of the NATO alliance, wouldn't it?
I mean, I think, again, yeah, I think this is why the most extreme option doesn't set the United States up well to materialize on the gains that it set out to have within the NATO alliance from the very beginning of the administration. It was a completely fair and logical criticism that many of the European powers, particularly the powerhouses economically of the European Union, had not been, paying their fair share toward, continental defense. And I think the administration has largely won the day on that argument. And I would think that the reason to stay away from the most extreme option is not only to keep the NATO alliance intact, but to keep the gains that have been made by this administration, for the strength and longevity of the NATO alliance by putting Europeans in a greater leadership role and getting our European allies to commit more on the spending front. I would think that they would want to keep that intact, and that would be a much higher priority than any gains that could be made from Greenland.
And I mean, this comes just as we've had that announcement from Britain and France after the meeting of the so-called coalition of the willing, along with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, of this agreement to deploy British and French troops as part of efforts to provide security backup, which relies on overall support from the United States. I mean, doesn't this somewhat undermine that commitment that we heard there from Steve Witkoff?
I think, I think that, the Greenland situation as related to what we're seeing, and this is kind of what I was alluding to, I don't think we would want, and I believe it was President Macron that in his statement when he was asked about, how the Greenland situation relates, I believe it was him that said, we want to keep these things distinct because, we don't want to jeopardize the gains that are being made, toward a sustainable and long-lasting peace deal. On the side of particularly the Europeans taking a larger leadership role there. And so I think, again, this is another reason why, certainly there's no reason for the administration to take the most extreme option on this one issue that jeopardizes gains on some of their other biggest priorities, like, reaching a peaceful end to the war in Ukraine.
NBC is reporting that the governments of Denmark and Greenland are requesting a meeting with Marco Rubio over President Trump's threats. I mean, clearly President Trump today was celebrating what he called the amazing military achievements in Venezuela, the very controversial seizure of its president, putting him on trial in a court in New York. Do you think he's been somewhat emboldened by that, to think that he does have the power. The US does have the military might to take over countries. He said that the US is running Venezuela, though it's hard to see how that's actually happening. But do you think he's been emboldened by the military success of that specific operation to take out Nicolas Maduro?
You know, again, I won't purport to sort of predict sort of President Trump's impulses, because I think no one can with great success. But I think the administration itself, you know, when we've seen this with other military operations that the U.S. has undertaken, Midnight Hammer and Rough Rider, the Houthi campaign come to mind. You know, I think there is certainly an emboldening at the outset of you know, these types of operations being a very good thing, and no doubt no one is mourning the fact that Nicolas Maduro is no longer in power. But I do think, you know, the questions of what comes after and what does this mean strategically for the U.S. approach to the region, I think are the questions that make it tougher to take a really strong victory lap, you know, long term, because these are questions we still largely don't have answers to. It's why, you know, we have administration officials at the most senior levels on Capitol Hill this week trying to answer some of these questions for what does it mean to run Venezuela? How is this consistent with the national security strategy as outlined by the administration? And do we need congressional authorization to, you know, continue any further activities? I think these are the questions that the administration has to answer. So if anything, I would say these types of activities, there's often an emboldening effect at the outset, but then when the hard questions come, that's where it gets difficult to stick to those guns.
Katherine Thompson, Senior Fellow at Cato for Defence and Foreign Policy, who's a former senior official at the Pentagon under the Trump administration. Really good to get your thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.